Richard
sorry to
Calloway
inform
stared
you,
at the
sir, but your
envelope on his
card has been
mahogany desk,
declined.
his name written in a child's careful handwriting across the front. The snow was falling outside his corner office window, blanketing Chicago in white just 3 days after Christmas, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd built an empire on tough decisions, on cutting costs and maximizing profits, on never letting sentiment cloud his judgment. That's what had made him successful, after all. But this letter, addressed simply to Mr. Calloway with a small heart drawn beside his name, had somehow broken through 30 years of carefully constructed armor. Inside was a single page, written in blue crayon, and he'd already read it a dozen times. Each word felt like a small stone pressing against his chest. He didn't know yet that this letter would change everything he thought he knew about success, about Christmas, and about what truly mattered in life. Where are you watching from tonight? Richard Calloway had always prided himself on being a practical man. He'd grown up poor in Cleveland, the son of a factory worker who died young from a heart attack brought on by stress and 60-hour work weeks. Richard had watched his mother scrimp and save, had worn second-hand clothes through high school, had worked 3 jobs to put himself through community college. He'd built Calloway Industries from nothing, starting with a small manufacturing plant and growing it into a company with 400 employees across 3 states. Every decision he made, he told himself, was to prevent anyone from ever having the power to make him feel small again. His office reflected that philosophy. Everything was expensive, deliberate, controlled. Leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. A view that looked out over the city like he owned it. Photographs on the wall showed him shaking hands with mayors and senators, cutting ribbons at grand openings, accepting business awards. There were no family photos, because Richard had never married, never had children. He'd dated, of course, but no one had ever quite understood his drive, his need to keep building and expanding. Work was his family. Success was his companion. December had been a brutal month for the company. A major contract had fallen through, and the numbers weren't looking good heading into the new year. Richard had spent 2 weeks reviewing personnel files with his CFO, looking for places to trim the budget. It wasn't personal, he kept telling himself. It was business. Companies that got sentimental about layoffs were companies that eventually failed, and he hadn't come this far to fail now. That's how he'd found himself reviewing the file of Sarah Mitchell, a woman who worked in the accounting department. She'd been with the company for 6 years, had good performance reviews, showed up on time. But she was also making $48,000 a year in a position they could likely outsource for $30,000. The math was simple. The decision should have been easy. On Christmas Eve morning, Sarah had arrived at the office wearing a red sweater with a snowflake pattern. Richard had called her up to his office at 11, right before the company's half-day closure for the holiday. She'd knocked on his door with a soft tap, and when she entered, he noticed she was carrying a small tin of homemade cookies. "I made these for the management team," she'd said with a warm smile. "My son and I, we bake them every year. It's become our little tradition." Richard had accepted the tin and set it aside without opening it. Then he delivered the news efficiently, the way he'd been taught in business school. "Sarah, I'm afraid we need to make some personnel adjustments. Your position is being eliminated effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay, and information about Cobra health insurance continuation will be in your final packet." He watched the color drain from her face. Her smile disappeared like someone had erased it. "Mr. Calloway, It's Christmas Eve, I have a son. I'm a single mother, and Her voice had cracked then, and he'd seen her fighting to hold herself together. "I understand this is difficult timing," he'd said, keeping his tone professional. "But from a business standpoint, there's never really a good time for these conversations. You have the rest of the day to collect your belongings. Security will escort you out." Sarah had stood there for a moment, her hands clutched together, and he'd seen something in her eyes. Not anger, but a deep, devastating sadness mixed with disbelief. "I see," she'd whispered finally. I thought we were doing good work here. I thought I mattered to this company." "It's not about your work performance," Richard had replied, though even as he said it, the words felt hollow. "It's about the bottom line. I'm sure you understand." She'd nodded once, picked up her purse and left without another word. He'd watched her walk back to her desk through his office window, watched her sit down and stare at her computer screen for a long moment before slowly beginning to pack her things. A few co-workers had approached her, and he'd seen her shake her head, saw her wipe at her eyes with the back of her hand. Security had eventually accompanied her to the door, and she'd left carrying a small cardboard box, her red sweater bright against the gray winter sky. Richard had gone home that evening to his downtown penthouse, poured himself an expensive scotch, and congratulated himself on making a hard but necessary business decision. He'd spent Christmas Day alone, which was how he spent most holidays, working on quarterly projections and answering emails. The cookies Sarah had brought sat unopened on his kitchen counter. By December 28th, he'd nearly forgotten about the whole situation. Then the letter arrived. The envelope had appeared on Richard's desk on a gray Monday morning, mixed in with the usual stack of mail his assistant brought up. At first, he'd thought it was some kind of holiday card that had been delayed in the mail, but when he opened it and saw the careful crayon writing, something in his chest had tightened. "Dear Mr. Calloway," the letter began. "My name is Tommy Mitchell and I am 8 years old. I am writing to you because my mom Sarah used to work for your company, but she lost her job right before Christmas. I wanted you to know some things about my mom that maybe you didn't know." Richard had set the letter down on his desk and stood up, walking to his window. The city stretched out below him, busy and indifferent. He'd told himself he didn't need to read this. It would only make things harder, and the decision was already made. Sarah Mitchell's position had already been eliminated, the paperwork filed. Reading a child's letter would change nothing about the business reality they were facing. But he'd picked it up again anyway. "My mom is the best person I know," Tommy's letter continued. "When my dad left us 3 years ago, she cried a lot, but she told me we would be okay. She got the job at your company and she was so happy. She said it was a good company with good people. Every morning she makes me breakfast even though she is tired. She helps me with my homework every night. She comes to all my school things even when she has to leave work early. Last month I had a Christmas program at school and she came, even though she said she had an important meeting. She sat in the front row and clapped the loudest." Richard had sunk back into his chair. He remembered Sarah requesting that afternoon off. Remembered thinking it was inconvenient timing, but approving it anyway because she'd rarely asked for time off before. "We don't have a lot of money," the letter went on, the handwriting getting a little messier, as if Tommy had been writing faster, trying to get all his thoughts down. "But Mom always makes things special. For my birthday, she made me a cake shaped like a dinosaur because dinosaurs are my favorite. For Halloween, she made my costume by hand because we couldn't buy one. She says love doesn't cost money and that's what matters most." I believed her until Christmas. Richard's throat had gone tight. He'd forced himself to keep reading. This Christmas was different because Mom didn't have her job anymore. She tried to hide it from me, but I heard her crying in her room at night. I heard her on the phone with Grandma, saying she didn't know how we'd pay rent next month. On Christmas morning, there were only 2 presents under our little tree. Mom gave me a book about dinosaurs that she bought at the thrift store and a new notebook for school. She said Santa had to be more careful with money this year. I gave her a drawing I made of us together. She cried when she opened it and said it was the best present she'd ever gotten. The words had blurred on the page and Richard had realized with shock that his eyes were wet. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried. Not at his mother's funeral 10 years ago. Not when his first company nearly failed. Not ever, really, since he was a child himself. "I know you're the boss at the company where Mom worked," Tommy's letter continued. "I don't really understand business, but Mom said you had to let her go because of money. I wanted to tell you that my mom is really smart and works really hard. Maybe you could give her job back. Or maybe you know someone else who needs a good worker. Mom says I shouldn't ask for things, but I thought maybe you didn't know how good she is at her job. She won that employee award last year. We still have the certificate on our refrigerator." Richard had actually gotten up and walked to his filing cabinet, pulling out Sarah's personnel file again. There it was, Employee of the Quarter for the second quarter of last year. He'd signed the certificate himself, though he couldn't remember doing it. He'd signed hundreds of them over the years. "I'm not writing this letter to make you feel bad," Tommy wrote, and Richard had let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Mom says everybody has their own struggles and we shouldn't judge people. She says you probably have a hard job making decisions. I just wanted you to know about her. Also, I wanted to say thank you for giving her a job for 6 years. She was happy working there. She said the people were nice, and she felt like she was helping the company do good things. That made her proud. The letter ended simply. I hope you have a Merry Christmas even though it's already over. Maybe next year will be better for everyone. Your friend, Tommy Mitchell. There was a small drawing at the bottom, a stick figure child holding hands with a stick figure woman, both of them smiling under a bright yellow sun. Richard had sat at his desk for an hour after reading that letter, not moving, barely breathing. His entire office suddenly felt different. The expensive furniture looked cold. The awards on the wall seemed hollow. The view of the city he'd worked so hard to claim felt isolating rather than triumphant. For the first time in decades, Richard Calloway felt small again, but not in the way he'd feared. He felt small because he'd made someone else's world smaller, darker, harder, and he'd done it without thinking twice. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. He picked up his phone, then set it down again. What could he possibly say? How do you apologize for something like this? How do you undo the damage when the damage is someone's Christmas, someone's security, someone's belief that the world is fair and good people are rewarded for their hard work? He thought about Tommy, 8 years old, hearing his mother cry through the walls. He thought about Sarah packing up her desk on Christmas Eve while other employees left early to be with their families. And for the first time in his carefully constructed life, Richard Calloway didn't know what to do. Richard didn't sleep that night. He'd gone home to his penthouse, still carrying Tommy's letter in his hand, and he'd sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city lights blur through the snow. He kept thinking about his own childhood, about the Christmas when he was 9 and his father had lost his job at the factory. They'd had no tree that year, no presents. His mother had made a special breakfast with pancakes and tried to act like everything was fine, but Richard had seen the fear in her eyes. He'd heard the same late-night phone calls Tommy must have heard. His mother talking in hushed tones about bills and rent and not knowing what to do. He'd promised himself back then that he'd never be in that position again. That he'd never be powerless, never be poor, never be the one who got discarded when the numbers didn't add up. He'd kept that promise. He'd built an empire. But somewhere along the way, he'd become the person he'd feared most as a child, the faceless boss who could destroy a family's Christmas without losing a moment of sleep. The thought made him physically ill. At 3 a.m, Richard had done something he hadn't done in years. He'd opened his laptop and started searching. He found Sarah Mitchell's address easily enough in the company records. She lived in a modest neighborhood on the south side, the kind of area where people worked hard just to get by. He looked up the elementary school Tommy attended. He even found Sarah's LinkedIn profile, where she'd posted about being grateful for opportunities to grow and learn, and shared articles about work-life balance and the importance of employee appreciation. The irony wasn't lost on him. By dawn, Richard had made a decision. He drove to the office earlier than usual, asked his assistant to cancel all his morning meetings, and started making calls. The first was to the head of HR. I need you to pull Sarah Mitchell's termination paperwork, he'd said. I'm reconsidering that decision. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Calloway, the termination was processed last week. She's already been removed from payroll and her benefits have been— Then unprocess it, Richard had snapped, then caught himself. Please, I need you to find a way to reverse this. Tell me what needs to happen. He'd spent the morning navigating bureaucracy he'd never paid attention to before. Forms and policies and procedures that he'd approved years ago without thinking about how they affected real people. Every obstacle made him more determined. This wasn't about the money anymore. This wasn't even about the job. This was about a boy who still believed the world could be good, and a mother who'd taught him that love mattered more than money. Richard had to prove they were right, but it wasn't that simple. HR explained that there were legal complications with reversing a termination. They'd have to justify it, document it, ensure they weren't setting a precedent that would expose the company to lawsuits from other terminated employees. The CFO pushed back hard, reminding Richard that they were still facing budget constraints. You can't let emotions drive business decisions, he'd said, and Richard had actually laughed. I've been letting the lack of emotion drive my decisions for 30 years, he'd replied. Maybe it's time to try something different. That afternoon, Richard had done something else he'd never done before. He'd driven to Sarah Mitchell's neighborhood himself. He sat in his car outside her apartment building, a modest 3-story structure with a small playground out front. The building needed paint. The playground equipment looked old but well-maintained. He watched children playing in the snow, bundled up in winter coats, their laughter carrying on the cold air. He wondered which one was Tommy. He'd almost knocked on her door. He'd almost walked up those stairs and tried to explain, to apologize, to offer her job back right then and there. But fear had stopped him. Not fear of rejection exactly, but fear of his own inadequacy. What words could possibly be enough? How do you face someone you've hurt and expect them to believe you've changed? He'd sat in his car for nearly an hour before finally driving away, no closer to a solution, but carrying Tommy's letter in his jacket pocket like a stone of conscience he couldn't put down. That evening, alone in his office, Richard had pulled out the tin of cookies Sarah had brought him on Christmas Eve. He'd never opened it. He pried off the lid carefully and found 24 homemade sugar cookies, decorated with colored frosting and sprinkles. They were simple, imperfect, made with care. He ate one, and it tasted like everything he'd been missing without knowing it. Warmth, home, the kind of sweetness that comes from someone's time and thought rather than money. Have you ever faced something like this? A moment when you realized you'd been living all wrong? Let us know in the comments. He picked up his phone and finally made the call he'd been avoiding. "Sarah," he said when she answered, his voice rough. "This is Richard Calloway. We need to talk." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Richard thought she'd hung up. Then finally, Sarah's voice came through, cautious and quiet. "Mr. Calloway, I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I received a letter," Richard said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. "From your son, Tommy." Another pause. Then, "Oh God, Mr. Calloway, I'm so sorry. I had no idea he'd done that. He must have found your address on some paperwork I left out. I never asked him to—" "Don't apologize," Richard interrupted. "Please, I'm the one who needs to apologize to you. Would you be willing to meet with me? I'd like to talk in person, if you're comfortable with that." There was wariness in Sarah's voice now. "Is this about the severance package?" "Because I signed all the papers. I'm not looking to cause any trouble." "It's not about that," Richard said quickly. It's about me making a terrible mistake, and wanting to try to make it right, if that's even possible." They'd agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near her apartment the next morning. Richard had arrived early, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee growing cold in front of him. When Sarah walked in, he'd almost not recognized her. She looked tired, older than her 34 years. She wasn't wearing the confident expression he remembered from the office. She looked like someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. "Thank you for meeting me," Richard had said, standing awkwardly as she approached. They'd sat down, and for a moment, neither of them had known where to begin. Finally, Richard had pulled Tommy's letter from his pocket and laid it on the table between them. "I've read this probably 50 times in the last 2 days, and every time I read it, I understand more clearly what I did to you. To your family." Sarah had looked at the letter, and her eyes had filled with tears. "Tommy's been worried about me. I thought I was hiding it better, but kids, they notice everything, don't they? Sarah, I want to offer you your job back," Richard had said. "More than that, I want to offer you a better position with better pay. I spoke with our HR director about creating a senior accountant role with a salary increase and more responsibilities. You've been undervalued at this company, and I take full responsibility for that." He'd expected relief, maybe even gratitude. Instead, Sarah had leaned back in her chair and studied him with an expression he couldn't read. "Why?" she'd asked simply. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because I was wrong to let you go, especially the way I did it, and I'm trying to correct that mistake." "No," Sarah had said, shaking her head. "I mean, why now? Why did it take a letter from my 8-year-old son to make you see that I was a human being? I worked for your company for 6 years, Mr. Calloway. 6 years of showing up early, staying late when needed, taking on extra projects. I won an employee award. I never called in sick unless Tommy was really ill. What changed between when you fired me and now besides you feeling guilty? The question had hit Richard like a physical blow. He'd sat there, fumbling for an answer, and realized the truth was more complicated and more shameful than he wanted to admit. Nothing changed about you, he'd said finally. Everything changed about me. Or maybe I finally let myself see what was there all along. Your son's letter didn't tell me anything I didn't already know on some level. It just forced me to actually look at what I'd done. Sarah had wiped at her eyes. I want you to understand something. When you fired me on Christmas Eve, it wasn't just about the money or the job. It was about dignity. It was about spending 6 years believing I was part of something, that my work mattered, that I mattered, and then learning in 5 minutes that none of that was true, that I was just a number on a spreadsheet that could be erased whenever it was convenient. You were never just a number, Richard had said, and then stopped himself. No, that's not true. To me, you were just a number, and that's what I'm trying to change. Not just with you, but with myself. I built this company by being ruthless and detached, by never letting emotions interfere with business decisions. And I thought that made me strong, made me successful. But Tommy's letter made me realize I've been succeeding at all the wrong things. They'd talked for over an hour. Sarah had told him about Tommy, about raising a son alone after her husband had left them for someone younger and richer. She'd told him about the nights she'd studied accounting while Tommy slept, earning her certification through online courses. She'd told him about the pride she'd felt when she got the job at Callaway Industries, how she'd seen it as a stepping stone to building a better life for her son. And Richard had listened, really listened, for perhaps the first time in decades. When they'd finally stood to leave, Sarah had made him a promise. I'll consider your offer, she'd said. But I need to know this isn't just guilt talking. I need to know you understand that I'm not a charity case. I'm a skilled professional who deserves respect and fair compensation. Can you promise me that's how you see me now? Richard had met her eyes and nodded. I promise. And I'll prove it to you every day if you give me that chance. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales like this one. 2 days later, Sarah had accepted the position, but Richard knew this was only the beginning of making things right. Sarah Mitchell returned to Callaway Industries on a cold January morning, and this time Richard was there to greet her personally. He'd arranged for flowers on her new desk, a welcome back card signed by her former co-workers, and a small framed photo of Tommy that he'd had printed from one Sarah had shared during their coffee shop conversation. It showed Tommy at his school Christmas program, wearing a paper crown and a huge smile. I thought you might like to have this where you can see it while you work, Richard had said, handing her the frame. To remind you why we all work, to build something good for the people we love. Sarah had held the frame carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. Thank you, she'd whispered. That means more than you know. But Richard's transformation hadn't stopped with Sarah. Over the following weeks, he'd done something radical for a man who'd built his empire on cold efficiency. He'd started actually getting to know his employees. He'd begun walking the floors of his company, learning names, asking about families, listening to concerns. He'd discovered that Marcus in shipping had a daughter starting college next year and was worried about tuition. That Jennifer in customer service was caring for an elderly mother with dementia. That David in IT was a volunteer firefighter who sometimes had to leave work suddenly for emergencies. Each person had a story. Each person mattered. Richard had implemented new policies, more flexible schedules for parents, better health insurance, an employee assistance program for people going through hard times. The CFO had argued that they couldn't afford it, but Richard had insisted. We can't afford not to, he'd said. A company is only as strong as the people who build it, and if we don't take care of them, we're building on sand. 3 months after Sarah's return, Richard had received another letter. This one was also from Tommy, but it was different. Dear Mr. Callaway, it read in that same careful handwriting. Thank you for giving my mom her job back. She is happy again. She sings in the morning now when she makes breakfast. She helped me with my science project, and we won 2nd place in the school fair. Mom says you gave her a chance to prove herself, and that's the best gift anyone can give. She says you're a good man. I think so too. Your friend Tommy. This time, when Richard's eyes filled with tears, he didn't try to hide them. His assistant had walked in with files for him to sign and found him sitting at his desk, crying openly while holding a child's letter. She'd quietly set the files down and left without comment, but Richard had seen the small smile on her face. On Valentine's Day, Richard had done something else unprecedented. He'd invited Sarah and Tommy to lunch at a nice restaurant downtown. Tommy had arrived wearing his best clothes, a button-up shirt that was slightly too small, and pants that he'd clearly outgrown a bit. But he'd walked into that restaurant with his head held high, holding his mother's hand. Over lunch, Tommy had told Richard about his dinosaur collection, about his dreams of becoming a paleontologist someday, about the book report he was writing on Tyrannosaurus Rex. Richard had listened with genuine interest, asking questions, sharing his own childhood dreams of being an astronaut. For the first time in years, he'd felt connected to something beyond balance sheets and profit margins. "Mr. Calloway," Tommy had said as they were finishing dessert, "Mom says you changed your mind about her job because of my letter. Did I really help?" Richard had looked at this earnest 8-year-old boy, at Sarah watching them both with careful hope, and he'd told the truth. "Tommy, your letter changed my life. It reminded me of things I'd forgotten, that people matter more than profits, that kindness is never wasted, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is care about someone else. You helped me remember who I wanted to be when I was your age, before I forgot what really mattered. So yes, you really, really helped." Tommy had smiled then, that huge, uninhibited smile that children have before life teaches them to guard their hearts. "I'm glad," he'd said simply, "because Mom really likes her job, and I like seeing her happy." As Richard drove back to his office that afternoon, he'd realized something profound. He'd spent 30 years building an empire, accumulating wealth and power and success. But in all that time, he'd never felt as rich as he did in that moment, eating lunch with a single mother and her son, listening to excited stories about dinosaurs, seeing the hope return to Sarah's eyes. The change in Richard hadn't been immediate or perfect. He still struggled sometimes with his instinct to prioritize numbers over people. He still had moments where the old, ruthless businessman surfaced. But now, he had Tommy's letter in his desk drawer, and whenever he felt himself slipping back into old patterns, he'd pull it out and read it again. He'd remember that every decision he made affected real people with real lives, real hopes, real struggles. Calloway Industries didn't become less profitable under Richard's new leadership. If anything, employee satisfaction improved, turnover decreased, and productivity rose. People who feel valued work harder, care more, and build better things. Richard had learned that lesson the hard way, but he'd learned it well. Sometimes the best gifts come in the smallest packages. A letter written in blue crayon by a child who still believed the world could be good. Tommy Mitchell had given Richard Calloway something more valuable than any business deal or profit margin. He'd given him back his humanity, and that, Richard would spend the rest of his life remembering, was worth more than all the corner offices and expensive views in the world. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts about redemption and second chances, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories like this. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages, and sometimes the hardest hearts can learn to feel again. Until next time, may you remember that kindness is never wasted, and it's never too late to change.